A bullet whizzed by Donald Trump's face and barely scraped his ear. And as we're closing out this conference, I think we just need to just remember how far our nation has come in the span of 1 year, of how much has changed. And thanks to the goodness and glory of God, that Donald Trump turned his head at that very moment.
That opening clip was of 31-year-old American activist Charlie Kirk at the closing session of his Turning Point conference in Tampa, Florida, from July 11th to 13th, just last week. For the closing session of the conference, he organized a debate between two conservatives with starkly different worldviews. Dave Smith is known online as Comic Dave Smith. He's a stand-up comedian and self-described libertarian. And our main guest in this podcast, the brilliant American writer and speaker, Josh Hammer. We'll start with a short clip of Dave Smith explaining his worldview and very openly demonizing the Likud party and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The sinister suggestion, of course, is that Netanyahu somehow manipulating America, a classic protocols of the elders of Zion, spin and garbage, frankly.
American foreign policy for my entire life has been insane and criminally insane. We've launched war after war. We've talked about peace through strength the whole time, but all we've gotten is permanent militarism and forever wars against countries that pose no threat to us. And a huge part of the reason why we've embarked on this is because the neoconservatives hijacked our foreign policy and they were in power after 9/11. And the neoconservatives, as everybody who's followed it knows, were joined at the hip with the Likud party. That's just a fact. They all admit it in their own words.
In their own words. I don't know about that. But Dave Smith does have a habit of being somewhat loose when it comes to intellectual discipline. His current mission is to convince young Americans that Israel is not an ally of America, and to support the country is extremely detrimental to American interests. Josh Hammer hits back here, explaining why American intervention, for example, in Iran recently, what they call the 12-day war in the debate, why American intervention was so important, and is very emphatically, Josh points out, supported by MAGA Americans.
The MAGA movement is actually quite unified, believe it or not, all the talk to the contrary when it comes to these issues. An overwhelming majority of self-identified MAGA Republicans support close U.S.-Israel relations. According to a CBS News poll, moreover, after the recent Operation Midnight Hammer B-2 bombers in Iran, 94% of self-identified MAGA Republicans supported President Trump's dropping those B-2 bombs on Fordo, Natanz, and the other Iranian facilities there. This is a wildly popular policy there.
Dave Smith, on the other hand, dismisses complex geopolitics as a sign of a deep, entrenched addiction to war, as he calls it. Iran? He says it's just a struggling third world country that is no threat to America, nor does it have the capability to in any way threaten America seriously. Here's his take.
This idea that the great battle of our time is us versus the Islamists, us versus these barbarians, that's really the problem here in the United States of America. Lebanon, that's what you got to worry about. Listen, I think everyone here, all you guys should know this at this point. Our problem in America is the deep state of the United States of America, okay? And you know what that deep state wants, by the way? Permanent war. That's what they always want. That's how they and their friends make their money. And so all of this talk is just so ridiculous, man. I mean, this talk about how, if you care about the holy sites in Israel, okay, sure. Obviously, Christians and Jews and Muslims have a connection to that land. But that doesn't mean we have to bomb Iran for Israel.
Dave Smith has a deeply flawed, really a downright ignorant understanding of the nature of the regime of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Its core ideology is to foment terrorism and spread Islam throughout the world, including America, and to subjugate all infidels, including Dave Smith. This is an expansionist, active threat to all liberal democracies. I'm Vivian Berkovich, former Canadian ambassador to Israel. Now for the main event, Josh Hammer. Let's do this. Tuesday, July 15th, just before 7 p.m. in Israel, where I am, and I believe it's just before noon where you are. Josh Hammer, welcome to State of Tel Aviv.
Great to join you. Thanks for having me.
I'm so glad we could do this so soon after you appeared at the Turning Point conference. You were the closing event in a debate discussion moderated by Charlie Kirk, of course, and you were one side, and Dave Smith, also known as Comic Dave Smith, was on the other. Charlie Kirk has a huge following. I know because one of my kids is a big fan and is telling me all the time I got to watch him more. He's got like 3.6 million followers on YouTube. And the Turning Point kind of convention brings together thousands of young people to discuss conservative issues in America. What's the vibe?
Yeah, so look, first of all, Charlie's a friend. Charlie and I have been friends for some years now. This is not the first Turning Point USA conference that I have spoken at. Charlie himself, look, he's a young guy. He's 31 years old. He's an evangelical Christian who, if you look at what he does on college campuses in particular throughout America, there is a rising tide. I'm sure I don't have to be the one to inform this audience. There is a rising tide of anti-Israel sentiment, which at times veers into the most virulent strands of medieval-style Jew hatred imaginable, that increasingly pops up on some of Charlie's events on campus. There's been this whole recent phenomenon over the past year and a half of Charlie being asked not just about Gaza or Iran, but being asked about various debates between the rabbis of the Talmud. It's a very disturbing trend, actually.
You mentioned that at Counterpoint, didn't you?
Yeah,
It's
because it really disturbs me on a very visceral level, seeing that this is what some young people are regurgitating. And the fact that this young 31-year-old Christian is put in this place to defend the legitimacy of the Talmud and of Judaism, the Jewish people, it's kind of just like one of those like, wow, like what the heck is going on in the world in the year 2025 situation. So, look, Charlie himself, as an evangelical, like many evangelicals, I think, has an instinctual love of the Jewish people and of Eretz Yisrael, of the land of Israel. Now, having said that, the polling, unfortunately, in many ways, is what it is when it comes to shifting attitudes among Gen Z Americans and even including Gen Z Republicans, conservatives, when it comes to U.S.-Israel relations. I don't work for Turning Point USA. I cannot speak for what exactly the intention was here, but if I had to guess, the logic that led to inviting me to participate in this debate was to essentially say this, for better or for worse, is a live debate that is currently playing out there. Let's go ahead and just air it out. Now, it's also worth noting, Vivian, this is actually not my first time debating Dave Smith. So this one's a lot more, is a lot higher profile. This one seems to have gotten a lot more clicks, downloads, attention. So I think that was essentially what the thought process was. But Turning Point USA, under Charlie's leadership, has become one of the largest young conservative grassroots organizations in America. You could definitely argue that it is the largest, actually. And Turning Point USA, I think a lot of people would say, did a lot of work to really drive Gen Z and millennial people to go out and vote for Donald Trump and J.D. Vance this past November and probably get him across the finish line in some swing states there.
So you're invited to debate Dave Smith at Turning Point. That took place 2 days ago. I've watched the whole thing very carefully, and it was a feisty debate. One of the things before we get into it, I just want to kind of set the goalposts so that our viewers and listeners understand what the purpose of this kind of matchup was, what the parameters of the debate were. How would you describe the debate?
Well, we were given three particular things that would come up at some point over the course of this debate. First and foremost, we want to begin the debate by talking about what President Trump refers to as the 12-day war, this recent
Right.
skirmish between Israel and Iran. By the way, Vivian, I was there, actually. I was in Israel when the war started. It took us 3.5 days to evacuate with our 6-month-old baby. It's a whole separate story, but I personally lived at least partially this part of the story. So Charlie wanted to talk about the 12-day war and specifically President Trump's decision to come in and to intervene, albeit in limited fashion at the end. And that would kind of be some of a proxy for differing worldviews when it comes to foreign policy and where U.S.'s relations fit into that and whatnot. That was category one. Category two was the one that I was least favorably disposed towards discussing, but nonetheless, again, Charlie's kind of like a very pro free speech guy. He generally typically believes that there's no point in hiding away from discussions, even if they are uncomfortable or make people uncomfortable. So category two was this notion that is popular in some quarters. Let's call it the Tucker Carlson wing, shall we say? That's the pro-Israel lobby that AIPAC and so forth have disproportionate influence when it comes to U.S. foreign policy. This notion as to what is Israel's standing as an ally of the United States. That was kind of all category two. And then category three, which is kind of painting an affirmative picture of foreign policy, what should that look like, and where do U.S.'s relations fit into it. So those are kind of the parameters of the debate.
So let's start with the 12-Day War, since it's so fresh in your memory and mine. I was here throughout the whole, obviously, 12 days. But where I live, in the middle of nowhere in southern Israel, although quite close to Gaza, we just didn't have alarms. I think we had 2 alarms the whole time, and that was just because Israel was blanketed with alarms. So it sounds like you probably had a bit more of a hairy experience than me. Having said that, it was a spectacular 12 days. And as you put it so adroitly and astutely, that, America was able to kind of come in with those magnificent machines that they did to hit Fordo, because Israel had basically obliterated the air defense. It kind of paved the runway and made it nice and smooth for America to come in and finish the job, should they choose to do so. And they did that. Dave, early on and throughout the debate, made comments of this nature. He started out by saying, we shouldn't be involved in any of these things like Iran and the 12-Day War, because Iran actually is not our enemy. And he says elsewhere, and Israel actually is not our ally. But he really went to town on Iran, saying that there's no evidence that Iran had any ambition to acquire nuclear weapons. Even the IAEA has not stated that. And this whole frolic he put into the context of what he sees as this, and he used the word warmongering, addicted to war, this kind of warmongering quality that he attributes to Israel, and in particular to Likud, and more particularly to Benjamin Netanyahu. He said, this is their problem. This is their frolic. Why are we getting involved? We don't have any beef with Iran. We have a beef with the deep state. That's our battle. And if you stick with the 12-day war thing and the way in which he seems to understand the world, it's just extraordinarily uninformed or disingenuous. Because Iran, as you point out and pointed out in the debate, is very much an adversary of the United States. Let me roll this clip of Dave's now, and then I want you to react.
I think, and I do think there's something really sick and poisoning about this, is that our country has become so addicted to war. And my point is that the war never needed to be launched to begin with. But there's no reason why we even have to be enemies with Iran. This is a third world country in the Middle East that does not have nuclear weapons, does not have intercontinental ballistic missiles, does not have an air force capable of hitting us with anything. This is Israel's problem. We don't need to be involved in this. Sorry, we got our own issues here.
Yeah, look, so this is the typical sort of worldview from libertarians and isolationists here in the American political spectrum. I mean, anyone who pays close attention to American politics knows exactly where someone like Dave Smith is coming from, where he is getting his talking points, and where he is getting his worldview. It's really not terribly different from Ron Paul back in the day, the longstanding congressman from Texas, one of Dave Smith's intellectual heroes. So it all kind of emanates from that. There are obviously some glaring problems here. On the one hand, the notion that the most powerful country in the world, this is probably the most important point, the notion of the most powerful country in the world can simply bury its head in the sand like an ostrich and just have nothing to do with the rest of the world is a fantastical and utopian notion that is essentially just the opposite end of the spectrum, but kind of paradoxically, just the other side of the coin from other utopian schemes that are harebrained to go awry, like let's call it socialism or Marxism. These are approaches to the world that might look good on a chalkboard, that might sound good when you read about it in an academic seminar, but just have simply no bearing whatsoever to the real world. And more to the point, there has never been an era in American history, other than, as many historians would argue, that interwar period, the 1920s, 1930s, that itself is perhaps a little over exaggerated. But with some exceptions aside, there have been very, very few instances in American history where America has actually done this. In fact, if you look at the first real wars that America fought after achieving its independence against the British and all that, the first two wars that we fought were the two Barbary Wars, the first and second Barbary Wars against the Barbary pirates, against essentially the early 19th century version of the Houthis, these radical Muslim pirates operating off the coast of northern Africa, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya. That was actually what galvanized Thomas Jefferson and to an extent James Madison as presidents to really build up the U.S. Navy. So this notion that America has ever had a period where we can just not care about foreign affairs is totally fantastical. Again, it just simply does not operate in real world. The point, Vivian, that I also really wanted to drive home, including this clip on social media where I kind of took out some of his old tweets there, I thought it was important in a very pro-MAGA, pro-Trump venue like Turning Point USA to just point out and drive home the point repeatedly that no matter what merits, or I would argue, and you would argue demerits there may be to Dave Smith's quixotic, utopian, and ideological worldview, whatever demerits there may be, it is also just as an empirical description. It is simply not the foreign policy as Mr. America First, Mr. MAGA, President Trump understands it. There is a concerted effort by some of these libertarian isolationist types. Tucker Carlson is probably the number one leading example of this. There is a deep concerted effort to hijack the mantle of America First and to try to make it out to be something as fundamentally other than what the guy who literally brought back the term Donald Trump understands it to be. But the guy who took out Qasem Soleimani outside the Baghdad, Iraq airport in 2020, the guy who took out the leader of ISIS, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the year prior, and the guy who just ordered Operation Midnight Hammer with all the B-2 bombing runs, this guy is not an isolationist. Now, it is definitely true that he is opposed to Bush-era moralistic spread democracy across the world. Guess who's also opposed to that? Me. I have a whole chapter in my book arguing against it. But Donald Trump understands foreign policy to be in the prudential, realist middle between these two equally ideological extremes, which happens to be where the overwhelming majority of Americans, and I would argue the vast majority of conservatives and Republicans, believe their foreign policy should be as well. Finally, I would just say that this notion that our enemy is not Iran. First of all, I mean, we know that's not true. I mean, the hostage crisis, 1979, Beirut, Lebanon, 1983, and the attempts to assassinate Donald Trump, which didn't come up at the debate. I probably should have brought that up, but it didn't come up. On and on we go. We know for a million reasons they are our enemy. But more broadly speaking, this notion that we can't walk and chew gum at the same time, that Iran is not an enemy, that the deep state is. I mean, what an absurd false choice. What an utterly absurd false choice. I mean, I am a conservative commentator, podcaster, etc. I have thoughts on all sorts of issues outside of U.S.'s relations. I also have lots of problems with the permanent bureaucracy, which some people refer to as the deep state. I have at times as well there. That's fine. There's a lot of problems with that. That has literally nothing to do with Iran. Nothing whatsoever. We can have the Iran debate without resorting to the deep state or to the capital gains tax rate or whatever. I mean, it's just completely irrelevant. It's a pure unmitigated red herring.
I was actually surprised, even for Dave Smith, when he made the statement that we don't have a problem with Iran. They're not our enemy. As you point out quite rightly, 1979, the hostage crisis, when Khamenei came back from France, and several months later, Americans were taken hostage and held hostage for, it was a year, no, it's 444 days. That's right, until Reagan's inauguration day. But I mean, that is a hugely significant part of the ideology of the Islamic Republic of Iran. They call you Big Satan in America. They regularly use the American flag as a doormat to stomp on at demonstrations and on and on and on. mean, this isn't something that, some wacky right wingers have made up. How, and I'm not asking you, I know you're not Dave Smith, you're Josh Hammer, but you're on stage with this guy, right? And you've been on stage with this guy a number of different times, and I'm seeing him be platformed by all kinds of people, really amplifying his voice. I don't see him as your peer in any way, intellectually, in the manner in which he presents and argues, certainly not his depth of knowledge. Why do you think you're being paired with Dave Smith? Why is someone like Dave Smith being platformed and elevated in this manner?
Personally, I don't think particularly highly of Dave Smith's analytical reasoning or his abilities. I mean, the guy is basically a D-list failed stand-up comic, now moonlighting as a single-issue provocateur, where he tends to say offensively stupid things. So I'm not a particularly big fan of this guy, to put it mildly. I guess there's two things going on here. One is, unfortunately, in my judgment, Dave Smith has a decently large following. He actually has, last I checked, far more social media followers than I do. So he has a following, and it seems like some people care about what this guy says. So, we can love that, we can hate that. I think you and I probably hate that, frankly. But again, it kind of just is what it is. And on the other hand, he says offensively stupid and largely uninformed, and above all, just deeply ideological things, right? This is kind of the number one thing that I was trying to hammer across, is how ideological this guy is. The isolationist libertarian position is just as ideological as Marxism, as Bush era neoconservatism. I'm the one taking a non-ideological, empirical, sober approach to these questions. So I tried to get that point over and over again. But no matter how ideological and tied to his dogma, frankly, that he is, he toes the line very close at times, but he's also not saying throw the Jews down the well and some of the other kind of medieval blood libels that folks like Candace Owens and increasingly Tucker's getting kind of close to that times too. I guess I'll put it this way, Vivian. You know, uh, Maybe Dave Smith's IQ is a standard deviation below median. Or whatever. I have no idea. I guess the question is, if you're making the decision to hold this particular debate there, I can't immediately think of who a better spokesperson on the other side would be, unless you're willing to kind of go onto the left, which is a whole separate conversation there. But I don't think the Turning Point USA would ever give a platform to someone who is openly of the left, who voted for Kamala Harris and so forth there. So I don't know. Again, I don't like the guy at all, to put it mildly. I think he is a sleazy piece of garbage, to be very honest with you. But I also am not entirely sure, if you're going to hold this debate, who the better spokesman, frankly, for the morally uninformed garbage side would be.
In the closing segment of the debate, which I'll include here because it's so pertinent, Smith openly sneers at the notion that any empire or country in the world could truly challenge America, the greatest power on earth. But he seems to ascribe to the theory that somehow little Israel has done just that. Here are a few choice bits of Dave Smith before we turn back to Josh Hammer.
Adolf Hitler and the Nazis couldn't bring down America. Joseph Stalin and the commies couldn't bring down America. The British Empire couldn't bring down America. But you think the Hezbollah in Lebanon are a threat to us? They're a problem for Israel to deal with. All I'm saying is, Israel has at every turn, and look, again, when I say Israel, I'm talking about the government of Israel. I'm not talking about the people there. And I'm specifically talking about Benjamin Netanyahu and the Likud party, who have been in control for most of this time, for most of my lifetime. Yeah, and right, most of the 21st century. And so when I say they have been constantly pushing America toward more aggressive policies, toward getting in more fights.
Now, back to Josh and why he is paired with his clear intellectual inferior, comic Dave Smith, with a dangerously deficient knowledge of history, current affairs, and a sloppy way of stitching them all together. Okay. I personally find it fascinating to see what I think is a reasonably new development in the last few months. Charlie did it at Turning Point. Other hosts do it on their platforms. And it is taking people like you who, whether I agree with you or not, are quality people who are able to present at a high level, and teaming them up with people who I think are much lower down the totem pole, if I can put it that way. And I think it's a really interesting question. Why? I mean, you're suggesting, well, there really aren't a lot of candidates out there who can and would articulate that position. Perhaps. I think that it also makes for great clickbait, and, fiery exchanges. Although I have to give credit where due, Charlie did a really commendable job of just kind of keeping things on the lowdown. He didn't let things get out of control.
I agree with that.
And I thought he did a very, very good job. The issue of Jews in America, and as you pointed out, Dave does the as a Jew thing a lot, which of course is, hey, I'm the good Jew, right? Like I'm against Gaza. And I thought one of his crazier lines in that discussion was when he speaks to a room full of young conservative people who he knows are probably 95% pro-life, and says, you can't be pro-Israel and pro-life.
He got booed for that.
That was an extraordinarily dumb moment. Talk about that for a sec, Josh.
Yeah, I mean, he got booed for that. That was probably the loudest boo of the entire debate, actually. But yeah, what a fantastically stupid thing to say. I mean, you're totally right. This is a very young conservative audience, mostly Christian. The overwhelming majority of people there are pro-life. Charlie is a very, very vocal opponent of abortion and a spokesperson for the pro-life position. And Charlie's been a supporter of the Jewish people in Israel for his entire young career. So you're offending not merely most of the crowd, but also the moderator and the host of the event itself. It's just totally nonsensical, and he was deservedly booed for that.
Yes, he was. And I'm just going to show that clip quickly now.
If you support what Israel's doing in Gaza right now, I would just, my advice to you guys is just know that you never have a leg to stand on claiming to be pro-life for the rest of your life. Just saying that. If you... Oh, so it's okay to support policies.
Let's not boo our speaker,
It's
Dave.
okay to support
Make
a
your
policy
message.
that is killing babies. All of a sudden, killing babies is negotiable. All right, fine. I'm just reading the room.
So, Dave, why don't you...
No, I'm not talking about for Hamas.
Hold on.
Human
Back
shields,
up.
dude. Human shields.
Hold on. Back up. Dave, why don't...
I just let you go
Dave,
on this whole long
I know.
thing.
I'm going to actually help you out
yeah.
here, Dave, okay?
He made a number of really sharp comments saying that, it's undeniable that the Jews control American politicians.
But I do think that the level of Israeli control over our politics is frankly pretty undeniable, as much as people try to. And listen, by the way, I'll just say this. Every single person in this room, you have to hate AIPAC. You don't even have a choice. You're here at Turning Point USA. AIPAC contributes millions of dollars to woke progressive Democrats if they support Israel. In other words, it's okay to destroy our country as long as that helps Israel. So their lobby should register as a foreign
That's a good
agent,
segue. Finish that.
and they should stop blackmailing our politics.
Got it. So...
AIPAC, he said, these people are destroying our country. They're going out and supporting woke Democrats who want to destroy our country. This is the Jewish lobby as he presents it. But that guy sat there on that stage and said what I think he's getting awfully close to Tucker and Candace world, in my view, when he says things like that. Do you agree?
Yeah, look, the line between... There's very little line between Dave Smith and Tucker Carlson. I mean, it's very, very... You're basically splitting hairs at that point, right? It doesn't even make sense. I mean, they're essentially the exact same. Look, AIPAC is a boogeyman, okay? AIPAC as an organization is the boogeyman. By the way, Vivian, in our exchange, I explained the various reasons that I'm actually not even necessarily the biggest proponent of AIPAC, actually. I gave them a paltry $54 check after being guilted to sitting down at a dinner 8 years ago. It's neither here nor there. But my own personal conception of Zionism fits a little bit differently than I think kind of the standard issue AIPAC conception of Zionism. But look, this notion that there is one kind of unified monolithic so-called Jewish lobby. First of all, it's utterly asinine on its face, and the number one person who should know that it's asinine on its face is Dave Smith himself, because he is, as he likes to remind us, nominally, purportedly a Jew. So the fact that Jews disagree so much, as Jews have disagreed at least since Yaakov and Esau, I mean, back to the debates of the Talmud, I mean, Jews have a habit of disagreeing. So the entire notion that there is one kind of unified monolithic quote unquote Jewish lobby is not just conspiratorial. It's just an empirical, demonstrable lie. I mean, where do groups like J Street and If Not Now and so-called Jewish Voice for Peace, are they not part of the so-called Jewish lobby? It just doesn't make any sense whatsoever, even on its own terms. Look, second of all, as I tried to explain, there are also clear historical anecdotes and data points and events that have happened that can very, very, very easily disprove the entire notion of a concerted Israel lobby or Jewish lobby. To me, the number one most shining example, I think I said this on the debate stage, was the 2015 Barack Obama nuclear deal debate. When Barack Obama got the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, that was AIPAC's number one priority at that time, was to prevent that from happening, because that was, among other things, the Netanyahu government's number one priority, and AIPAC thought that it would be bad for America, bad for Israel, and so forth there, right? They failed. They totally failed to do that there. And I think for many people, that was kind of a mask-off moment to be like, wow, AIPAC is actually not nearly as powerful as a lot of people once thought it was. Second of all, the point that I will make as well, and I probably should have said this on stage, is that the other obvious reason we can disprove the alleged influence of this pro-Israel lobby or Jewish lobby is the mere fact that we were having that debate on stage in the first place. Was the mere fact that this sentiment, this rising tide of isolationism, of anti-Israel sentiment, of on the fringes of actual anti-Semitism outright to core, the fact that all these things are ascendant in various quarters there, and the fact that Charlie and Turning Point decided to host this debate where we're talking about things such as the alleged influence of pro-Israel forces on American foreign policy, that itself is a shifting of the goalposts. And that itself, I think, really frankly just disproves the fact that, let's call it the pro-Israel establishment, AIPAC and like-minded organization, that disproves the fact that they have done, frankly, if I can just be very brutally honest here, that they have done anything other than fail in their efforts to try to kind of keep the goalposts where they were as recently as 10, 15 years ago or so.
Yeah, no, it's a very different world, and I would say they've been pretty disemboweled in the last 10 years or so. Josh, I want to kind of close by asking about this. I mean, you're there. You're American, you're on the ground, you're very involved in the public conversation about these issues. And do you sense a shift? Do you sense a change in the way that young people in particular, the people in their 20s and their 30s, are looking at America's role in the world, are looking at what I would refer to as America's traditional alliance with and support of Israel in particular? Is the ground shifting underneath our feet? And is this something to really be concerned about? Because these are the people in 10 years, 20 years who are going to be running for Congress and the Senate and making decisions. How deep, how real is this kind of current of vitriolic anti-Semitism that is being amplified more and more? Is it real?
Yeah, the wind is shifting. I think anyone who has two eyes to see and two ears to hear will be able to discern that fairly easily. The polling shows it overwhelmingly clearly, how even polling within self-described conservatives or self-described Republicans, support for Israel in its war in Gaza and so forth there typically tends to decline the younger the demographic you go. I attribute this to two, maybe borderline three main factors. Charlie and I have actually discussed the first factor on his show, which, because again, he's 31, I'm 36. We're roughly up a similar demographic bucket. There are a lot of millennial and Gen Z conservatives who kind of came of political age in the context of America's failed wars abroad, the failures of Iraq, when it comes to preventing Iran from becoming anything other than an Iranian satrapy, the failures in Afghanistan of preventing that from becoming anything other than a Taliban-run enclave, the failed intervention in Libya in 2011, which today is just a jihadist civil war 14 years later. So a lot of folks have grown up in the context of this and are just instinctually just dead opposed to America being involved, especially when it comes to the Middle East and so forth there. Now, it is my sincere hope that things such as Donald Trump's precision surgical strikes on Qasem Soleimani in 2020, such as the 12-day war of the B-2 bombers, it is my hope, especially something as richly symbolic as Trump deciding to have the B-2 bombers fly over the White House on July 4th, our great National Independence Day. It is my hope that these sort of things will demonstrate to younger conservatives, maybe above all, that there is such thing as a genuine, clear military diplomatic success, such as what President Trump was able to achieve, working off the backs of the IDF and so forth there in the recent 12-day war. So that is my hope. It's also my hope, and this is kind of the point that I tried to make over and over again on stage, and that I write about in my book, Israel and Civilization, is also my hope that some people will begin to understand that there really is a very clear and pretty compelling, prudential, sober, realist foreign policy that is America first, that is neither neoconservative nor Tucker Carlson isolationist. It happens to be the exact same foreign policy of Donald Trump. It's really the foreign policy of in American history. It's been kind of the dominant strand of thinking about the world, was not necessarily in deeply ideological terms, but in sober terms that recognizes that we have interests, real interests. We have allies, real allies. We have enemies, real enemies, and so forth there. So that came up on the debate stage. That came up in my book as well. And it is my hope that especially as we have successes like the 12-day war, like younger conservatives, will start to appreciate this a little more. One of the bigger problems as well, and I don't entirely know, frankly, what exactly to do about this, is that there has, and this is a totally different point than I'm making now. There's been a very, very real, and I would argue legitimate decline among Americans, but especially younger Americans, in the trust of authorities and the trust of elites. There are any number of data points to point to. There was the Russia collusion hoax that came out in the 2016 election, for which we still have no justice today. Above all, there was COVID-19 and the failures of the lockdowns and all of that. There was the Hunter Biden laptop, the Twitter files, and there's a lot of examples that have made younger Americans severely distrustful of authorities. Higher education authorities obviously have their own, terrible bag of worms there, right? And look, I share that sentiment, but that sentiment is also a double-edged sword, because when you so lose trust in believing anything, you naturally are going to start to just ask questions about anything. And this is a bit of a slippery slope at times towards outright conspiratorial thinking. And historically, we know where slippery slope, outright conspiratorial thinking typically leads. It typically leads to things like the Jews, the Jewish lobby. So this is a bigger problem that I don't pretend to have all the answers. We're not going to have all the answers in our conversation now, but it is something that I definitely have observed, and it's something that I think about a lot. The final thing that I will say is that there, you and I were just talking about the American founders, George Washington, how this was a form of Christianity, a form of Protestantism that was very Old Testament Hebrew Bible centric. And it really
Right.
was. It really deeply was. There now is a rise within even Christian theological circles of some types of Christian theology that would have been historically anathema to America and that do not necessarily portend well for Christian-Jewish relations and U.S.-Israel relations. For instance, Tucker Carlson, and bring up his name one final time, he had on his show, I don't know, maybe a few months ago, a leading advocate of let's call it replacement theology, which essentially says the Jews have no special claim to being the chosen people, no special claim to this, to that. Unsurprisingly, this guy is viciously anti-Israel in his worldview. So this type of theology, again, I'm not a Christian, obviously, but it seems to me, at least in certain quarters, to be on the ascendant as well. So that is part of the puzzle. I don't think it's necessarily the predominant part of the puzzle. It's still a somewhat fringe phenomenon, but it's something that I'm paying increasingly close attention to, I would say.
A lot of very deeply concerning sort of tendrils weaving around out there, and how it all resolves and they knot up in the end is going to be really something to keep an eye on. Josh, how did the room feel to you? You were there. We talked a bit about booze and cheers and I was trying to judge myself, but the camera was constantly on you guys and didn't pan to the audience at all. What did it feel like to you?
I think the room was split. We both had applause lines. Now, as I said, Vivian, Dave got booed multiple times. I don't think I was booed once. I don't think. So, I mean, Charlie did one of these online polls on X, Twitter, who won the debate. I think Dave Smith won 60-40, but X, frankly, these days is so disproportionately overrun by these freakish Nazis and Pakistani bots that I don't really take that for much, to be honest with you.
It's a very skewed platform.
Yeah, exactly. Frankly, a 60-40 quote unquote loss is probably something close to a win, actually, believe it or not. The room felt very mixed to me. My impression is that the youthful conservatives at a place like a Turning Point U.S.A. conference are disproportionately Christian. They are disproportionately very favorably inclined towards the Holy Land, the holy people, the Jewish people. They are skeptical, perhaps, of the extent of tight-knit U.S.-Israel relations because in their minds, they associate that with the failed wars of the past 25 years. And part of the job of folks like me is to try to kind of untangle this and to try to make them less confused and to try to make the case for U.S.-Israel relations and a prudential, sober, realist foreign policy that doesn't have anything to do with the wars of the past 25 years and so forth.
Well, you're doing a great job. And many of us are grateful to you for it. Josh Hammer, thank you so much for your time today, your insights, and keep fighting the good fight.
Thank you, Vivian. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening. Have a look at the show notes for this episode, where we include information about Josh Hammer's recently released book, Israel and Civilization, The Fate of the Jewish Nation and the Destiny of the West. A must-read if you want to really understand the detail and fact of the American right today. And big thanks to Josh for speaking with State of Tel Aviv and beyond. Please, don't forget to like us, love us, comment with 5-star ratings on the podcast platform you use on YouTube or on our Substack page. And please, if you are not doing so already, consider supporting our work with a paid subscription. You can do that at stateoftelaviv.com. Please show your appreciation. We are truly independent and rely totally on listener support to continue delivering quality content. Have a great week, and until next time, stay safe and stay cool. We love hearing from you, so please comment on our website, stateoftelaviv.com, or send us a note to hello@stateoftelaviv.com. On behalf of the State of Tel Aviv core team, Jan Zabo, our creative, graphic, visual, and marketing man, Amir White, producer and editor extraordinaire, sound guy, who is also impressively patient with me and my boomer tech deficiencies, and our social media manager, who pitches in on everything, Maya Naftalin. Thanks to the team. Thanks to you for being here. We'll be back soon.